Hello, I'm Andrew Gentile.
And I'm Arianna.
And you're listening to Behind the Flicks. This show is all about me sharing as many facts as I know about filmmaking and directors and behind the scenes info about movies and whatnot to Arianna. And you'll join us for the ride. Our guest today is the co-creator of Me. But he also influenced my decision to go into filmmaking, as covered in our episode about Kill Bill. Since I was about 8 or so, I knew about filmmaking, and when my mom always gushed over Tarantino during my formative years, this guest always talked about Hitchcock, Spielberg, and Lucas. Please welcome my dad, Brian Gentile. How are you doing, Chopper?
Good. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Well,
that is an
A
old reference.
loyal patron of Behind the Flicks.
That's right. That's an old reference to talk radio that predates the two of you by quite a lot.
Oh, darn.
So before we ask you questions, Dad, Arianna, can we please get a review of this episode's film?
The review of this episode's film is Star Wars: A New Hope, the original Star Wars film that introduced this series to the world. And I just got done watching it about 30 minutes ago. And it is a fun ride. It's action-packed, especially for the date that this movie was released. It doesn't go more than, I'd say, like 20 minutes without something major happening. And it's about a story of a young kid who is learning about his destiny, more or less, I would say. And also about a fabulous rebellion against an empirical political party that is gruesome and destroyed the Jedi that you don't really know about until much later, but it's mentioned, and it's just the beginning of an epic story.
And Arianna, the big question, what grade you gonna give it?
Ooh, I mean, it's fun, it's entertaining. Han Solo, I think, makes it quite what it is. I give this one a B+.
Dad,
B+.
reactions?
Wow, it's harsh. B+ would be harsh. It was epic in the summer of 1977 at its release. It was epic. I've watched it many times since, but I haven't watched it in a number of years. I watched it just a few days ago, and I believe that the term epic still applies. So I would give it a very strong A.
Ooh.
Non A+?
An A+. I mean, it's one of the most memorable movies of my lifetime.
Sure.
If not the most memorable movie of my lifetime.
How old were you when you saw this?
13. I was 13 in the summer of 1977. I'm thinking back. Yeah, that's right. And, and this movie was so impactful on that moment in my life, not just for me, but for everyone around me. You could argue for the entire United States and eventually the world.
What?
It was this big. I'm telling you, it was one of the movies that literally created the term blockbuster.
What? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yes.
Explain
Wow.
what the literal term blockbuster is.
Well, it meant that a movie was so popular that as it moved across the country to theaters, the groundswell of interest was so high that people would stand in line around the block from the movie theater to get tickets first, and then to get a great seat. And so the term blockbuster meant that the line snaked all around the block of the movie theater.
My mind is blown right now. I mean, of all the times that I went to Blockbuster Video and everything, like, I never put that together.
That was it. This is one of those movies that had a sea change effect on the culture of the country, partially because of its timing, but I mean, it was a brilliant story, brilliantly told, new backdrop. I mean, the story behind it is ages old, right?
Yeah.
But
Classic hero's journey.
Classic in so many ways that I know that we'll talk about, but applied to a new genre of like smart science fiction and with new effects. The effects in 1977 were mind altering. Today, looking back on it, it was, you see a bunch of some kind of look cheesy today, but in 1977 they were state of the art.
Yeah, it really didn't look that bad. I mean, you could tell that
Right.
it was dated in comparison to what they have now, But I mean, like, everything was in time. Nothing looked flat. Like, the characters interacted. Like, the CGI was not that bad.
Agreed.
Well, there's a little. Well, okay, we'll get into that later. Sorry.
There's a fact about it.
There's a fact about it. But I gotta say, I'm kind of, in terms of the grid, I'm kind of in between Dad and Arianna. I'd give this on a when I'm feeling not generous, an A-. On a not generous day. Generous day, it's one of my favorite. A. It's one of my favorite films of all time, obviously.
Yeah.
And so because it's about magic, and it's about it's about magic, and it's about the hero's journey, and I don't know, but I think my dad described it better than I could. So thank you, Dad.
Yeah, ditto.
Yes. So Dad, you answered my last question first, which was, what did Star Wars mean to you and the people of your generation? That was going to be my last question in this. So let's just jump to describe your first time seeing Star Wars.
It was the summer of 1977.
Right. But go into more detail.
Well, so I remember the first time I saw it, I was with two of my closest friends, and we waited in line and we bought our tickets and we saw it, and we were so blown away that it was everything we could do to wait to the next weekend when we could get back to the movie theater. And this time we didn't have any money to pay for it, so we snuck in. And we were blown away again. And so the following weekend, we snuck in again. And so, that's what we had to do because we wanted to see it. We didn't have the money.
Not enough cash flow on the paper route.
Exactly. Yeah, when you're 13, that's what you do, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe not all 13-year-olds, but it was, for me and my friends, it was just this moment of amazement. And it was like we felt like some new film genre was born, some new story in a new way of telling it. And part of it was a reaction to the elegance of the story itself. Some of it was a reaction to the characters, which were beautifully drawn. And then some of it was a reaction to the moment in time in the United States, right? So you guys probably aren't putting it together, but it was just 2 years after the final exit from Vietnam. Amazingly, sort of war-torn, socially disruptive decade, the 1970s. And so the nation was, in many ways, kind of looking for a hero, right? And what this story does, A New Hope by George Lucas, what it did masterfully was the hero in the story is actually you as the audience goer, right? Everybody identifies while watching with one or more of the characters. And so you're literally projecting yourself into the story, which is sort of the ultimate arc in any story, right? When you feel part of it. And so that's what it did to this generation for whom this story was fresh and new, and the moment was ridiculously right. And so that's hard to get across, even in this kind of discussion about it, about what it meant in that moment.
And, okay, so please tell me your usual reaction when I ask you to tell me what your favorite film is.
My reaction is, when you're my age, there's no way to have one film that stands out that much above the others. There's usually a cluster of like 10 or so that you could point to from different genres or eras or decades or something. But when you push me, I say Star Wars: A New Hope, because of everything I've just described to you, because it was more than just the story and at the moment, mind-altering special effects and brilliantly drawn characters. It was about the moment in the country and in the world. That's all of that together makes it, and then my friends and sneaking in and all that, it makes it, altogether memorable.
So, do we have any final thoughts before we dive into the next section?
I have so many. I'm not sure what you want, Andrew, because I've
no.
many thoughts.
That was great. That was great. I'll ask you questions throughout the proceedings.
Cool.
Yeah. I guess I do. the proceedings.
Yeah.
I do want to, like, I hope that anybody that catches these is, getting more and more excited about understanding the time frame that a film comes from and, like, the makers behind the films, because
Absolutely.
like you said, this movie's so massive, but I wasn't around when it came out, so all I do is hear about it, and it's easy for me to forget the time period of which it came out and the fact that it did have a huge impact because of that time period. Mm-hmm. And it brings out a whole new appreciation for films through time. And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because through doing this and talking to Andrew about movies, like, I'm learning more and more to appreciate it and look into it more often too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I could think of several movies that were equally well timed, and that's, maybe that's just serendipity for the directors and the actors and the movie makers. But I could think of, like, Apocalypse Now, unbelievable, like, epic timing. Space Odyssey 2001, same thing. So yeah, there are just some movies that have an amazing accelerant amplification based on the timing and the coincidence of the moment.
Yeah, saying the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, right story, properly told at the right time.
Yeah.
Awesome. By the way, I'm trying to keep quiet because I have 6 pages, how many pages? 5 pages of notes, research that I did, not including the introduction page. So I'm keeping quiet for right now. So if you guys have any other thoughts.
No, I'm excited to get to these facts.
So really, listeners, if you don't like hearing me talk, if you like hearing Arianna talk, or if you like hearing our guests talk, skip this episode, because I'll be doing a lot of jabbering on about facts. Hopefully we'll be able to have our guest and my trusty co-host, dive in as often as possible. But first, before we dive into the facts, I just want to say one thing. The film we'll be covering this episode was suggested by our good friend and a loyal listener of the podcast, Jake Sickle. After the second episode of Behind the Flicks, he wrote to us that troubled film productions are a great topic, which I absolutely agree with. He went on to list a number of films, including Star Wars. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a great guy, right?
Yeah.
Good call.
Yeah, we love him. I'll be dropping his YouTube channel link in the description. So this episode, we'll be covering Star Wars. Everybody who has a passing knowledge of film history knows how, seemingly out of nowhere, it became the highest grossing film, not adjusted for inflation, up until that point, and made its writer-director, George Lucas, a household name, and launched the career of one superstar, Harrison Ford. What else can be revealed about its history that hasn't already been covered innumerable times by innumerable sources? Actually, quite a bit. But in order to find those little golden nuggets of historical facts, I had to do research that I've been doing since I was 8. Finally, after all these years, my Star Wars fandom seems to have paid off. By the way, in this episode, I will do my absolute best to stick to just the facts regarding the first Star Wars, not the entire series as a whole. Covering the Star Wars franchise is a mini-series in and of itself.
Yeah.
By the way, just for the record, I'm an armchair historian, so I read about half of this.
Oh my gosh.
So, but no, it was actually like quite a treasure trove of information regarding Star Wars. So if anybody is interested in learning more about Star Wars, I definitely recommend picking up The Making of Star Wars. So anyway, Arianna, Dad, let's talk about the history behind and success story that is Star Wars. The success story began after perceived failure. George Lucas's feature-length directorial debut, THX 1138, was an adaptation of one of his groundbreaking student short films. THX 1138 was produced through American Zoetrope, a company that Lucas founded with his friend and fellow filmmaker, Francis Ford Coppola. American Zoetrope was given funds through the film studio Warner Brothers. These funds allowed the studio to develop the script for other projects, including Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now, which Lucas was, at that stage, set to direct. However, Lucas's bleak, dystopian science fiction film confused Warner Brothers, and THX 1138 ended up dying at the box office. Warner Brothers made Coppola pay back the money they gave him for American Zoetrope. In order to repay his debt, Coppola took up the job of directing The Godfather.
Oh, darn.
Yeah.
Did what he had to do, you know?
What
Exactly.
a setback.
I know. Well, actually, this is a totally separate conversation for the Godfather episode, but he didn't want to do it because he didn't like the book. So, and so he was hired because he was like on near the teens of the list of people that they wanted, and he was only hired because he was an Italian filmmaker. That's the only reason, and he had a reputation.
Wow.
So,
It's good.
Coppola challenged Lucas to create a happy film. So, Lucas founded his own company, Lucasfilm, and took up the challenge. He called his film American Graffiti.
Oh, yeah.
But in order to get American Graffiti made, Coppola attached his name on Lucas's film as producer. And his name carried clout at that point because The Godfather was released and was a smash hit. But before Lucas even wrote the script for American Graffiti, he wanted to create a science fiction film. That film was originally going to be an adaptation of the adventure series of comic strip character Flash Gordon.
Oh my gosh.
But Lucas couldn't get the rights to that character, which set him on the path of creating an original screenplay, a process which lasted over 3 years. There are many inspirations that went into the creation of Lucas's screenplay, from the cinema of Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, who directed The Seven Samurai, The Hidden Fortress, stuff like that, Rashomon, to Lucas's research into the mythology of various religions throughout the world, and to the adventures of characters such as Robin Hood and, yes, Flash Gordon. But what really shocked me when reading the creation of the screenplay and the making of Star Wars was two things. The first is just how different each script was from the last. All of these changes are just too complicated for me to explain verbally. But I'll give you guys one example, and I want to hear you guys' reactions to this. One example is the title. The initial title changed from The Star Wars initially to The Adventures of Luke Starkiller as taken from the Journal of the Whills, Saga 1, Star Wars.
Wow. Good thing they avoided that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the shooting script title. That was like the one that they were like they handed out that they had revised it right before, like the last draft before they started filming was that title, according to the making of Star Wars. They were like, yeah, this is good.
They wouldn't have fit that on a single billboard ever.
Yeah.
By the way, I pronounced Wills with an H because there's an H in Wills.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Makes it altogether less sensible.
Well, I as you noted, they were creating this world, and so they were basically they were just shooting in the dark at this point, I think.
Yeah. I remember the commercial on TV advertising the movie in that summer, and even the advertisement was like shockingly different, right? It was this voiceover picture of dark space, enter this what looks like a planet, but we know later it's the Death Star. And then as the music swells and the voiceover continues, the Death Star explodes into this massive, interstellar explosion. And then it fades to the word Star Wars in the logo format. And everyone was just like, wow, what is this? So they did a good job thinking through a build-up to the release of the movie and getting everybody talking about it. So for some reason, I just thought of that when you were describing.
That's actually you brought up an excellent point. Thank you, because your area of expertise is partly marketing. Am I right? Because you're a busy businessman. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and the marketing for this movie was different. That was a big part of it. First of all, it wasn't based on a book. The movie wasn't based on a book, and a lot of the other very popular movies at the time had been based on books. The benefit of making a movie based on a book is you already have an interested, knowing audience, right? Like The Godfather is a great example. Mario Puzo's book was a New York Times bestseller for I don't know how long before they turned it into a movie. So everybody that read the book wanted to see the movie. Star Wars had nothing. They had to not only make this world up, but then they had to let the world know that there was something worth going and watching when it wasn't based on anything else they had previously attached themselves to. So I think they did a really interesting job with leading up to it in clever ways that hadn't been done before, one of which was television advertising.
Building up the anticipation. Patient.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I ruined your joke. I'm sorry.
Rocky Horror.
Good reference to another good movie.
Another good movie that's kind of totally not related. The second shock that I had when reading about the screenplay creation was just how close Lucas was working on reworking the script to the shooting date. For example, the first day of filming was Now Just Star Wars started on March 22nd, 1976. The draft that they had for filming was rewritten by two uncredited writers, Gloria and Willard Hike, and was dated March 15th, 1976.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And they made major additions. Just one example. Before that draft, Han Solo ship.
There you go.
There we go. Wow. The Millennium Falcon did not have a name. Considering the fact that Lucas was already having art design, special effects being worked on, and sets built, that's kind of insane. I mean, they were really kind of close.
The ship itself wasn't changed, but the fact that they gave it a name to make it more impactful, that was the addition?
Well, that was one of many additions that the two uncredited writers made.
Okay. I like the Millennium Falcon design because it was so distinct.
Yeah.
You could, when it was in a scene, you didn't have to think, you just knew, oh, there's the good guys.
Yeah.
Right? You got TIE fighters, you got X-Wing fighters, you got cargo ships, you got, Imperial destroyers or whatever they are. And this was just super distinct.
Speaking of, moments in the film, like your favorite parts, what were your guys' favorite parts of the film? Let's start with Dad.
So many. I mean...
Well, this is where you can air it all out.
Well, okay.
It's a safe space.
The end of the first act was, especially on this most recent viewing of mine, was more stark, more distinct than I remembered from the past, right? The end of the first act is basically when Obi-Wan Kenobi issues what is referred to as a call to the cause to Luke Skywalker, right? He says, Luke, you have to go pursue Jedi training. You have to leave this all behind. The rebellion needs you. You need to go train to be a Jedi. And how does he react? He says, can't do it. Got too much going on here in Farmville, right? And it's only when he goes back, he gets on the speeder and goes back and finds his uncle and aunt blown up, killed, that he has this instant change of heart in being called to the cause, right? Usually you think about stories, there's usually a wandering there between the first refusal and then the acceptance. And for him, it was like he zips out, he sees everything's blown up in his current world. He zips back and he says, I'm in. And I just don't remember being that quick, that brief.
Yeah, same here.
He's just in. And if you think about it, that's the end of the first act, right? Is when he says, I'm in. He's called to the cause and he's in. Prior to that, it's a little bit of, the storyline is a bit of restless young man would be the classic story, right? Restless young man. He's in the wrong place. I could also liken his early character to that scene in Kill Bill, and I'm doing this to tie my wife into the storyline, right? Where the Bill character says to Uma Thurman's bride, he says to her that you are like Superman because you wake up every day and you are Superman. You are a killer. And if you try to put on clothes to be somebody else, you're covering up who you really are. Well, you think about Luke in Farmville, he's covering up who he really is, right? He comes from Jedi royalty and he's stuck in Farmville. So he's already fish out of water. That creates this restless young man.
Yeah, and he doesn't understand why.
Yeah,
he's
right.
just trying to break out and he's done with it, but he hasn't figured it out. And it was like, then this opportunity path comes in his way and it's like, I think that he wanted to immediately when he was like, let's go to
Absolutely.
Andorol, the planet.
Yeah.
Alderaan.
And he just like went, oh, yeah, wait, but my parents said I got to stay here. Maybe I shouldn't. You know, it was like kind of like a reactionary fear, but I think he'd always wanted to go, which is why he switches so fast.
I think that's perfect, Arianna. That's right. He was struggling with loyalty to his uncle and aunt who'd raised him, but otherwise he was ready to go. He had no interest, right? He was counting the days till he could get out already. And so so that whole stream of logic and then to the end of the first act was super compelling to me. I thought they did it really well. I also think what really gets you is the second act. I mean, obviously, that's what a second act is intended to do, right? The second act ends when they rescue Leia. And now they have her safely aboard the Millennium Falcon. And you could tell that they got away so easily. And they admit it and they say something's strange because we got away. But if you think about it, at that moment, they kind of had everything they needed. They had Leia, they had gotten her, they had reunited R2-D2 with Leia, and Han Solo or I should say Obi-Wan Kenobi was involved. So they kind of got back to where they were supposed to be. So it was a real clean wrap on the second act. And it set up this massive conflict for the third act. So I thought that the buildup was just so well done, and the cleanliness or the how compelling it was as you transition from Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3. I just thought this is the brilliance of it. And Act 2 is where Han Solo just takes over the show.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and in fact you could say it's Han Solo and Princess Leia, really, right? That's the dynamic in the second act that you just go, this is a brilliant story. You expect it all to be about Luke, but it's almost equivalently about these other characters and you don't know where they're coming from. The backstories there's huge backstories that are thinly veiled that you know are there, but you don't know anything about them. At least we didn't in 1977. So it was all set up so perfectly that the third act concludes with what? You want more. You don't want the movie to end, right? The third act concludes, they're victorious. They blow up this Death Star. They get their medals. They're at the face of the rebellion. But you're like, no, it can't end here. They've got so much more to do. And, it's just perfectly set up like that. So that's what I love about the whole movie. It's just unbelievable arc, start to finish.
How like
character
cleanly
development.
they turned the pages for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely agree. The structure is amazing, and it's kind of one of those great screenplays. What do we think of the moments in the film? Like what? Like I mean, like
yeah. When you were talking about how the end of the second act when they rescue Leia and how like you see all of them kind of come together in that arc, it reminded me of the moment in the garbage.
Yeah.
Where they just barely make it. And I just, like, when I was watching that and seeing all of their reactions, it was like the moment where they all melded because they're all like, oh my gosh, we're alive, and like overly joyous, and Han and Leia hug, and like Chewie's like freaking out. And it's like the moment where they all become like, now they're
united.
They have a synergy now in the situation they're in.
Great.
And I feel like it made them all like instantly care about each other. And I just loved that moment when they all were like, we made it! Like I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. Also, you notice in that second act, during the rescue, they use humor really effectively.
Yeah.
Right? And in sequence, 2 moments of humor stand out for me. One, Andrew and I joke about all the time. We reference it all the time, but it's worth pointing out. It's when they're blasting their way into the cell block and they basically kill all the stormtroopers. And now Han Solo has to pretend that everything's okay there. They're trying to prevent them from sending more reinforcements of stormtroopers. So he says something silly, like, everything's fine here now, thank you, and how are you? And, it was just it was almost whimsical in a really tense moment. And he pulled it off so well that you're just like, oh, it was this mixture of comedy with real drama in a sci-fi movie. You just didn't see that at the time.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, not much later, when Luke makes it to Leia's holding cell and opens the gate, the pod door, first thing she says to him is, you're a little short for a stormtrooper, aren't you? It's like, really? The two major characters, the first thing they say to one another is a piece of comedy that was really, I even wondered if that was like unscripted or something. It was just so well thought through.
So what's amazing about the dialogue and the jokes in that sequence is it describes their characters. Like with Han Solo, it definitely like him saying everything's fine here now, thank you. How are you? That's not only funny, but it also informs his character. Like gives the
perfect. I couldn't agree more. And you got the cadence just right.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes. You did.
I've been practicing it since I was 8.
That's true. Yeah.
You are well aware of that.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that.
He made sure to be the subject of your practice, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Another fact that's kind of crazy to consider is that while Star Wars is one of the most successful franchises of all time now, that success was far from guaranteed. The most successful science fiction film up until that point was Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. That film, which was released in 1968, only made a profit by 1971. In short, films dealing with science fiction were not immediately destined for big box office. So the studio funding Star Wars, 20th Century Fox, had little faith in the film. But when American Graffiti became one of the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, at that point in history, Lucas and company had leverage to negotiate contracts before filming Star Wars. Lucas knew, even at that point, that he had written so much for Star Wars that he wanted to create a series of films. So, in a move that surprised 20th Century Fox executives, instead of demanding more money, Lucas demanded full control and total rights over Star Wars' merchandising and the Star Wars sequels.
Oh my gosh.
Amazing.
There had been
Smart move.
Smart move.
Exactly. There had been no precedent for either of those two things doing as good as an original film at that point in film history. Fox executives gladly gave him those rights and, at the end of the story, lost out on billions of dollars for decades to come.
Yeah. Beautiful. This is what I mean about the marketing around it. It was you could always tell that the marketing around the movie was just different. And of course, once you saw the movie, the marketing possibilities were staggering.
Merchandising.
Because the merchandising was staggeringly big because the characters were so beloved already.
Yeah. And the world was so big. I mean, everything about the world is different than, a standardized film. So, of course, you could create these little gadgets and merch that people are going to be like, I want that because you only see it in Star Wars.
The studios just had no experience with other revenue models other than ticket sales and rights to the intellectual property of the movie. That was all they knew. There had never been a movie prior to this that demonstrated such enormous capacity for merchandising, so why would they have even factored that in? And as for future movies on the same, on the same theme, it's like, come on, we haven't even done the first one yet. Why would we care about that?
Yeah.
Nothing was proven about this. And as you said, they were already skeptical about science fiction. So I'm sure they felt like, well, this is a great way to just minimize our risk. If this director/producer is going to, negotiate away what the only thing they really knew as revenue generating, profit building, for them, I'm sure it was an easy decision in the moment. They didn't know that the whole world was going to pivot literally around this movie.
Yeah.
So, unsurprised.
The only precedent really before that was like Disney films having like marketing for their musicals and like records and storybooks, stuff like that.
Yep.
Not for a science fiction film.
No.
No.
Nothing at this scale. Nada.
Exactly. By the way, here's another fact that kind of shocked me when I read The Making of Star Wars. Between Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and Mark Hamill, guess who was paid the least amount of money?
Well, I think you're reeling us in to say Carrie Fisher, but
that's what I want to say.
she was a descendant of well-known actors. So I'm going to say Harrison Ford.
Arianna?
I mean, Mark Hamill on the chances I win this.
Dad,
that's a good guess.
You are correct. The answer is Harrison Ford at $750 a week.
Beautiful.
Wow.
By comparison, Peter Cushing, who played Tarkin, remember Tarkin, Ariana?
Oh, yeah.
The guy in the gray suit, kind of like Grand Moff Tarkin, who the bony guy, you know him?
The older, dark gentleman who always was standing next to Darth Vader. He was even Darth Vader's superior. He was Darth Vader's superior.
Yeah.
Very famous actor.
Peter Cushing, who played that character, was paid $2,800 a day.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
As Michael Scott would say, my, how the turntables, or something like that. Yeah. There were many people working behind the scenes who would go on to become legends themselves. One of the artists who worked on the creatures in the famous Cantina sequence was Rick Baker, who would go on to do the werewolf transformation in American Werewolf in London.
Nice.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
That's a really good fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That Cantina scene was
Yeah.
world changing, right? I mean,
Was it really?
There were so many references to it in just the country's lexicon after that. There was just so much impact that one scene had. I mean, so many scenes, if you break them down, had big impact. But the Cantina scene was the most joked about, the most talked about, just all by itself. It was epic.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't like you. Oh no, okay, let me chop your arm off. No big deal.
Exactly.
Another behind-the-scenes legend was Dan O'Bannon, who worked on the special computerized Death Star plan sequence. Remember that? Like the actual grids?
Yeah.
Yeah. O'Bannon wrote the screenplay for 1979's Alien.
What?
Cool.
Yeah.
That's sick.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, basically they got everybody who was involved, who was even tangentially related in monsters and science fiction. They kind of try to put them in this movie, you know?
Yeah.
No, they didn't. I mean, you can't do it much better than they did in Aliens. That was
Exactly. Another person by the name of Ben Burt would make some of the most significant contributions to Star Wars. Burt's passion for sound began as a child when he would hold a tape recorder up to a radio and record whatever he heard. As an adult, Burt was assigned by Lucas to create the sounds of the world of Star Wars, from blasters to lightsabers to Chewbacca's grunts and growls and beyond. Funnily enough, Burt also used his childhood recordings of the radio as sound effects in the film. So
that's great.
Yeah, like the static and the yeah. I mean, that's kind of a weird hobby, but thankfully it paid off.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. Good for him. Industrious little kid.
Almost as weird as having an 8-year-old who wants to be a film director. Steven Spielberg recommended a certain composer by the name of John Williams for George Lucas after his exemplary work scoring Jaws.
Yeah, right. I remember that fact. That's big.
What do we think of the score and the sounds of Star Wars, guys?
I mean, it's awesome. They make it epic and very signature to the movie, I feel like. I mean, maybe I just say that because I've heard that sound my whole life and you instantly know it's Star Wars and it doesn't sound like anything else. But, I mean, I thought it was amazing.
So I'll put myself back in the day when I first saw it and tell you, because this was the movie, the music, the score, elements of the score became equally famous to the movie, right? I mean, I don't know, what do you, sorry, Andrew, what do you refer,
What?
the title sequence or the title composition, right?
Opening theme.
Yeah, the theme, the opening theme is so well done, and everyone knew the opening theme. It was, it was just as identifiable as the characters in the movie, which says something all by itself. And then if you notice throughout the movie, they use sections of that theme in different time sequences and different amplitude to highlight moments, especially the good guy moments. The Jedi, when Luke and the gang are on a good move, they use that music in a very upbeat way. But one of the things I noticed in this most recent watching is that other than the opening theme and the closing, a lot of the score kind of falls to the background, which I think is a good thing, right? It becomes a strong complement without getting in the way at all. It's just like there and it's heightening every scene, but it's not like individually memorable. What's memorable beyond compare almost is the opening and closing theme song. I don't know. That was what I took away from the most recent viewing.
I agree with you. I agree. Because I remember, like, you know, the scene where he's looking out into the desert in the beginning of the movie with
Yeah.
looking out on the sunset. Like, you're not super focused on what you're hearing, but it's still, like, moving you somehow as you're
Exactly.
watching him, like, gaze into the sunset.
Yeah.
And so, like, I feel that the few times that it sticks out at you is when the theme happens.
Yeah. I
And
like
everything
that.
else is just kind of, like, helping you feel through the movie without really
Yeah.
pulling your attention.
And I think in that specific theme, in that specific scene, I think it was like a fraction of the band, and it was at a different time sequence. It was longer. It was, I don't know what the right musical term is, but it wasn't as fast. It was a slower timing, and so it was more melancholy, right? It was more like you're feeling this emotion of Luke as he's looking out over the horizon, and yeah, that was big.
Yeah, that theme is called the Binary Sunset. That's the name of that.
And you've told me that before, right?
Yeah. That's an amazing sequence because it's one of those places in the film where you can finally just slow down for a second, which is so necessary. It's kind of like winding it up in order to spring forward with the action. It's kind of like giving the audience a little bit of a break, and that sequence delivers that. So,
Yeah, that's a great interpretation. I agree.
yeah. Despite all these moving parts, and the fact that Lucas was trying things that had never before been attempted in the history of filmmaking, 20th Century Fox wanted to release Star Wars on Christmas 1976. For those of you keeping track, filming began in March of that year.
Yeah.
In an attempt to make that date, Lucas would bicycle from soundstage to soundstage, sometimes monitoring 3 separate crews who were filming 3 separate parts of the film simultaneously.
Wow.
Lucas would eventually check himself into the hospital due to the pressure making the film and was diagnosed with hypertension and exhaustion.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Wow. All for a date that wasn't to be.
But before that release date, Lucas held a screening for several of his filmmaker friends in February of that year. Some of his friends included Brian De Palma and Steven Spielberg. However, Lucas showed the film without John Williams' score, which was not yet recorded, and without most of the special effects. For example, when the Millennium Falcon fights the TIE fighters, that scene was cut to World War II combat footage instead of what you see in the final film.
Oh, gosh.
So it cut from like the actors to a totally different movie.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So basically the filmmakers who were in the audience were like, what? What is it? Like they were expected to like understand what was going on.
So I'm guessing those early screenings didn't go over too well.
That screening did not go over too well, except for one person. Spielberg was apparently the only one in the group that had faith in Star Wars. But Lucas was feeling down on his film. In fact, Lucas was so underconfident in his film that when he was visiting the set of Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Lucas made a bet with the other director. If Spielberg gave Lucas 2.5% of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Lucas would give Spielberg 2.5% of Star Wars. According to Business Insider, that means Spielberg would end up making $40 million off of Star Wars, while Lucas, according to my calculations, and Dad, correct me if I'm wrong, you can Google this later, and you're the math whiz. Lucas made roughly $7.5 million off of that bet.
So Close Encounters did well, but not anywhere near Star Wars, is your point.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah.
Correct. You are correct, yeah.
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 It's not a bad idea, though, generally speaking. I mean, for those who can make such a deal to kind of hedge their own bets, it's not such a bad idea, really. Not bad. I'm impressed by that wisdom all by itself. Huh.
Surprisingly, 20th Century Fox executives had the opposite reaction to the filmmakers when they first saw Star Wars. One of the executives even praised it as the greatest film he'd ever seen.
Even at that version?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, believe it or not, yeah. But most movie theaters had no interest in showing Star Wars. But 20th Century Fox demanded that in order to show The Other Side of Midnight, an adaptation of a wildly successful novel of the same name, they had to play Star Wars. Now, when they did, it shattered box office records. And The Other Side of Midnight was kind of a flop. And Star Wars went on to win 8 Academy Awards, including an honorary Oscar for the exemplary sound editing done by the aforementioned Ben Burtt.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea that Star Wars was nominated for Oscars.
And it won 8, yeah.
It won 8.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was
Now,
epic,
okay.
I told you.
Sci-fi movies barely do that today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I got it. Now I didn't want to bring this up because he's kind of a hot button issue right now. But the film actually lost Best Picture and Best Director and Best Screenplay to Woody Allen's Annie Hall.
Right.
Now here's the thing, guys. I have a hot take. I have wrestled with myself at nights about this, seriously. But I think I've come to a conclusion. If I had to redo the Oscars that year, I'd give Best Director to George Lucas, but I would leave Best Picture for Annie Hall. As a film, I mean, as mythology and as a cultural impact and all these different things, I think Star Wars is definitely the superior film. As a film, I think Annie Hall's the superior film. Sorry, guys. Sorry, everybody. I'm gonna get reamed by the internet for this one. I'm sure. But I think Annie Hall's just as a piece of cinema is the better film. But as mythology and cultural impact,
I understand your logic. I don't agree with it, but I understand it, and I think it's a fair characterization. I don't support your conclusion, but
fair enough.
But I support the logic behind it. One of the things we haven't talked about, but is so principal to the timeline story you just told, is Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, didn't exist in this form before Star Wars.
Right.
And so they were creating all of the worlds that are debuted in the movie. They were creating them from scratch. They were creating new techniques for making those worlds seem real. I mean, it was so much groundbreaking work going on to make Star Wars. The fact that they tried to do it on that timeline seems impossible. And of course, it ended up being so. But even then, releasing in May of '77 is really remarkably fast, given all that they had to accomplish that had nothing to do with the actors. And in terms of camera-ready models and of the worlds and everything that they had, the fighters and to work with, I mean, I've just got to believe. I mean, they were so painstakingly detailed that, I mean, it just seems like literally they're creating worlds and then trying to figure out how to film them in a way that creates this realistic look and feel. And they did a great job for 1977. It was just, like I said earlier, it was mind-altering at the time.
I mean, Arianna, when you look at films with spaceships, before Star Wars, they were. If you ever see this movie called Forbidden Planet, it's like 2 pin pie trays glued together. It kind of looks like spinning around almost. It looks totally smooth. Meanwhile, George Lucas was smart enough to say, well, no, this has to look like this world has history to it.
Yeah.
There has to be a logic to it, even if that logic doesn't make sense to us. And so that's why they're all like the little pieces in it.
Yeah. The only thing close that had been previously accomplished, I would say, would have been 2001.
Yeah.
Right? Some of the space scenes in 2001, there were relatively few shots, and the complexity was a lot lower, I would argue, in 2001. In Star Wars, there were way more shots. The complexity level was much, much higher, and the realism was even better.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of the special effects, we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast how like the special effects didn't look too bad versus how. I just want to let you know, Arianna, my dad and I watched a different version of the movie from what you saw. So George Lucas, back in 1997, he made alterations to the movie, and he started making alterations for years to come until he sold all the Star Wars movies to Disney. So basically, like, there are entire scenes that are added in the film that are not in the original 1977 release.
Snap.
So personally, I'm kind of against that. So I made my dad sit down and watch the original Star Wars with me. So, like, for example, like, the original Star Wars is not called Star Wars A New Hope. It's called Star Wars. Remember the sequence with Jabba the Hutt that you saw?
Yeah, with him and Han Solo outside the ship.
Yeah, that was cut from the original.
Oh.
Because they didn't have the technology to make Jabba the Hutt move back then. And they added that back in 1997.
What?
Yeah.
That was one of the scenes I was tripping out about how good the computerization was.
Yeah,
they didn't have
was done years later.
Yeah.
Andrew's told me this before. Yeah, we didn't meet Jabba the Hutt until
Return of the
which
Jedi.
one? Return of the Jedi. Yeah. And right, I remember. I don't remember A New Hope as the title. It wasn't. There was no title A New Hope until much later when they had created the first trilogy, finished the first trilogy. It was just Star Wars. There was no chapter title to it. Of course, makes sense though, right? I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, they were smart about it. When you watch the movie, there's so many lines about "You're our only hope. This is our hope." You know. Yeah. So I mean, at least they made a good conscious decision on what to name it after the fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting thing because Star Wars fans have now been like, I'll probably, this is a huge discussion that could be a podcast episode on its own, but there's like this whole controversy on the internet about like, oh, George Lucas is changing Star Wars and not letting the original Star Wars be seen. So I'll probably link to videos of that in the description. But
get curious.
In case people get curious, yeah. But it's so like, for example, people have like the version that Dad and I saw. Literally, what somebody did was that they bought prints of the movie, like film prints, in order to get the original version, and they scanned it one frame at a time, the entire movie, and then they cleaned it up on their own. Like, this is just an independent project, independent of any studio, because they want a good quality version of the original movie to be available. Disney isn't doing that. Disney isn't.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So if you were to stream Star Wars: A New Hope right now, you would be seeing the altered version that Lucas re-released in the 90s, correct?
Well, he made further alterations for like two more times, I'd say.
Really?
Yeah.
So he continued tweaking it?
Yeah.
Wow. So it's a lot different than the original release in 77.
There are like 3 scenes added, shots altered. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dang.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know. Okay, so as a critic, Arianna, what do you think about this? Do you think that directors should be able to go back and change their films? I'm of the opinion personally that it's fine to change your film so long as you make the original available.
Same. Because a part of me is like, the original has value, It's the first thing that people saw. I think that there's definitely like an audience for people that don't want to see alterations. They want to see what the original public viewed during the original release. So I think it's important to make sure that that's accessible to people. But I mean, if it's your own project and you didn't have the resources and or the time to make it how you wanted at the time, I don't see anything wrong with you like adjusting and putting forth the effort to create the project you dreamed of originally as a director. Because I think that's cool to watch too.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's interesting to see a director's take or a creator's take on their own material later in life, but at the same time, they should also not poo-poo the original,
Yeah.
By the way, I think George Lucas is a genius, and I think what he's done for cinema is amazing. These are just my own personal opinions. All right. Do we have any final thoughts?
On the
Anybody?
movies?
Speak now, forever hold your peace.
So wait, this really birthed the career of Harrison Ford? This was his first major film?
Well, he was in American Graffiti before.
He was in American Graffiti, right?
But pretty much, okay. So he had been in The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's film, and he had been like in little bit parts. But this is the first film where he was like really pretty much front and center.
Oh, okay. Gosh, I didn't know that because I'm watching the movie and I'm like, oh, Harrison Ford's the only like recognizable face, but he's not. He was just as new as everyone else. What about Carrie Fisher? Was she in anything major before this?
Shampoo.
Just her name.
She was in this movie in a brief role called Shampoo with Warren Beatty and Goldie Hawn and Julie Christie.
Shampoo was a big hit, relatively. Her role, if I remember right, her role was small in that movie relative to the other stars because there were some big names in that movie that Andrew just mentioned, and so her role would have been small. But as I said earlier, she was from Hollywood royalty, right?
That's
Debbie
right.
Reynolds and Eddie Fisher are her parents.
I love Debbie Reynolds. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
cool.
I guess, a final thought for me would be, so I'm thinking about the end of the movie, and at the time, the story, that first chapter is pretty well sewn up, right? And many movies end with less conclusion than this one ended. It ended, good guys win, characters arced, faith in goodness prevails. So much was wrapped up, but the backstories and the backdrop that had been created through that story arc was so enormous that it was all we could do to hope and wait for another chapter. And so I can't help but think back to that summer and thinking, like, they've got to do something more with this, right? Like, they can't let this end, even though at the moment our thinking was, well, this story is kind of closed, but there's so much else going on that they mentioned. It's something else. Little did we know that, that A New Hope was like this much of a galaxy that George Lucas had in mind. And so what's amazing is that the second one, Return of the Jedi.
No. Empire Strikes Back.
Sorry, Empire Strikes Back. But then A Return of the Jedi. So the second and third in sequence of being created, the second and third movies were like they just kept getting better in our minds, and so like a whole new, you couldn't imagine how excited people were about the second one, right? About The Empire Strikes Back, and then Return of the Jedi. You can't even imagine, and the fact that they were as good or better. I think there are some critics of those, but by and large, the story just keeps getting better, and the characters keep arcing, and you keep learning more amazing things about the characters and their backgrounds, and I don't know. So I just think that it was the beginning of something that all by itself, the chapter was amazing, but the story that was about to unfold was 10 times more amazing.
Now that you say that, it's like, because right in the beginning he mentions, his father and his uncle wants to drop it, and there's like all this history that never gets touched on outside of that first act with Luke and Obi-Wan, and like it just leaves you wondering, like, he had to have thought of the backstory, with when he released this movie. He had to have like given some forethought to it, that there could be more, or that I have so much more to these stories, and if people like this, I'm gonna continue to explore it. But yeah, I mean, he had to have been thinking about that. I mean, between the merchandising thing and, just how rich everything became, I don't think he was no dummy. I think he thought about that before, like, even as he was writing this first movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think George Lucas was definitely had a lot of foresight. And what's this is kind of a success story in terms of keeping the faith in your own vision. And I think George Lucas was very smart at doing that. So, George Lucas, if you're listening to this podcast, feel free to come on as a guest. We'll have a good time with you.
Yeah.
Speaking of guests, Dad, where can people follow you? Do you have anything you'd like to promote?
Wow. Not really.
Oh.
I'd like to promote my son, Andrew Gentile.
Exactly. If anybody needs freelance movie
Instagram?
editing, if anybody wants freelance movie and audio editing, Andrew Gentile is the place to go. He's a recent graduate of San Francisco State's film school.
That's right.
He's experienced. He's energetic. He has an uncanny knowledge of film. And
all right.
Yeah, that's honestly what I want.
All right.
I wanted to hear the dad spiel.
Yeah, there it was. Did you have a link you can send him to, Andrew? Maybe your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, I could do that. I could do that, actually.
That's what I want to promote. I want to promote you and your launching into what should be an amazingly successful career in and around filmmaking.
Thank you, Dad. Arianna, any closing thoughts for you?
Go rewatch this movie if you haven't, and you'll fall in love with it all over again.
Listeners, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to shoot us an email at independentcreatorstudios@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please write a review and subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or YouTube. We'd love to hear your feedback. Behind the Flicks was created by myself and Arianna. I researched, wrote, and edited this episode. My name is Brian Gentile. This has been an Independent Creator Studios production.